Okay, so today I will be presenting my final projects for Classics 12, Mapping Ancient Greece, and I will be presenting on the changes to the Agora over time. To start, I will look at the Prytaneion and the Archaic Agora, which is located to the east of the Acropolis. The Prytaneion was the former town hall and head of the Athenian government back around 6th century BC and somewhat before that. However, the Athenian Agora had to change over time to expand and show Athens's increasing cultural, civic, and commercial power and influence over the ancient world. And for this, they needed a larger area, and they eventually ended up moving the Agora from where it was. And as you can see that from this little annotation, there was a lot of trouble trying to find out where the Prytaneion was originally. Recently, we've kind of narrowed in on this location. However, it was formerly thought that the Prytaneion used to be where the Agora is now. So this is where the Agora currently stands. Pausanias incorrectly refers to this as the Kerameikos in his book and calls the Roman Agora the Agora. Again, this caused a lot of trouble for researchers when trying to figure out where exactly this original Agora was. This is an image that I used to map out the buildings that you're going to see in a second. And there's also a bunch of links down here in the bottom for the timeline in Topos Text and Pleiades databases explaining more information about the Agora. Throughout this entire project, there's going to be extra links and sources and greater detail that I will not exactly go into, but will show to the viewers so that they have a chance to be able to go into this project afterwards and look on it on their own so that they can expand their knowledge however they desire. Okay, so first I'll be going through the stages of the Agora. So the first was the Archaic Agora buildings. This was not the Archaic Agora, but these were buildings built during this period. And I define the Archaic period from the 6th century BC to 480 BC when the Persian War happened. Next, we have the classical Agora buildings. This was after the Persian War. The Persians invaded Athens, destroyed much of the city and many of the buildings. And for this reason, many of the archaic buildings actually had to be rebuilt. But then as Athenian influence over the ancient world grew after the defeat of the Persians, they had to expand their buildings to fit with their growing government and commercial lifestyles. The classical era also lasted until about 323 BC when Alexander the Great and the Macedonians conquered Athens. These buildings highlighted in blue are from the Hellenistic era. The Hellenistic era lasted from 323 BC all the way up until 30 BC when the Romans conquered Greece. And the Roman buildings are shown here in purple. And these buildings were, like I said, built from 30 BC up until about, I'm going to say 150 AD, which is when Pausanias would have been about traveling through the area and would have detailed his travels. And so that leaves us with how Pausanias saw the Agora at the time, which would have looked something like this. As you can see, I've kept the buildings and included the roads. So when Pausanias traveled through, this is what it would have looked like to him, and these would have been the buildings that he's describing. And so for that reason, I'm going to go into a few details on a few of these. First is the Temple of Hephaestus. At this point, I like to turn on the 3D buildings, and you get to see a nice image of what the building would have looked like. And for reference, the terrain is off as well. Now, the Temple of Hephaestus is one of the best preserved buildings in all of ancient Greece. It is on top of the Kolonos Agoreos. It's a hill overlooking the Agora and is on the west side of the Agora. It was originally constructed to honor the god Hephaestus and Athena as well. Now, some people also refer to this as the Hephaestion. Pausanias referred to this very briefly in his travels. And because of it being so well preserved, we still have information from the facades on the building. And the labors of Heracles are depicted on the east facade, and the labors of Theseus are depicted on the north and south sides. And we knew that in the past there's a building called the Thesion. And because the labors of Theseus were displayed on this, most researchers assume that this was the Thesion. And this misnomer actually led for decades. Researchers were not able to properly assess where the Agora was and what buildings were actually in the Agora. This is one of the reasons that the Prytaneion was so hard to find and has not only been discovered until recently. Here's an image of what the Temple of Hephaestus looks like today. Like I said, it was so well preserved because in about the 7th century AD, it was converted into a church, the Church of St. George. And for this reason, the inside was completely changed. The outside was kept the same, but the inside was completely changed. But because this was a church, it was unable to be excavated for its materials or touched by anyone else. And that is one of the reasons that it's still so well preserved. As you can see here, this is an image of what the church plans would have looked like for the Church of St. George. Today, it is still one of the best preserved buildings in all of ancient Greece. Keeping the 3D buildings on, we're going to go to the other side of the Agora to one of the other best preserved buildings, but not so much preserved as reconstructed, and that's the Stoa of Attalus, gifted to Athens by King Attalus II of Pergamon during the Hellenistic era around 150 BC. King Attalus studied in Athens, and this was his gift back to the city. The Stoa was 2 floors, and it consisted of about 42 shops in total. So this was mostly for commercial use. And this was built in the Hellenistic era, as many other buildings were, to exemplify the growing economic and commercial power in Athens. Not only was the Stoa of Attalus built, but the South Square, which consists of the Middle Stoa, the East Building, and South Stoa 2, were largely commercial and were very large shop-based commercial buildings. This is an image of the Stoa of Attalus today, and the reason that it looks so good is because it was reconstructed in about 1953 AD by the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, or ASCSA. Today is their headquarters. Many offices take up the buildings that are still in it. It is still 2 stories, as you can see from this great 3D rendering. And in the basement of the building is actually where a lot of artifacts are kept so that researchers can study them. A lot of these artifacts are from the Persian Wars, which were found because the Athenians dumped many of their pots and the pottery and buildings into these big pits after the Persian War. Once they needed to get rid of everything and once they were trying to rebuild, there's these huge pits scattered all over the Agora. And a lot of the pottery from these pits is currently in the basement of this building. And it's because of the pottery and the dating of the pottery. And it's been very easy to date some of the buildings and some of the structures within Athens due to what was found in these pits. Next, we'll travel to the Metron, and basically the administrative buildings, which are located in the southwest corner of the Agora. These are built up of the Metron, the Bouleuterion, and the Pholos. The Metron is also known as the sanctuary of the Mother of Gods. And that's what its original purpose was. If you look back on the archaic Agora buildings folder, you'll see that the Metron looked very, very different. It was expanded during the Hellenistic era, and not only was it still the sanctuary of the Mother of Gods, but it also took over the role of being the city's archives. And it housed all the laws and notes that were made up in the city. And for this reason, it is grouped into the administrative buildings within this corner. This was a place where people could go and converse and hang out, especially those members of the Boule, since it is in such close proximity to the Bouleuterion, but also normal citizens were allowed in this area as well. Pausanias briefly mentions this, but he only talks about some of the stuff inside. And so for that reason, he doesn't give a great picture of maybe some of the archives that were used inside. Here's an image displaying what the Metron would have looked like at the time, though we don't know the exact what would have been in each of these buildings exactly because it is not a greatly preserved building. And this is an image of just the plans for the entire southwest corner of the Agora. As you can see, the Tholos, Bouleuterion, and Metron, as well as the eponymous heroes across the street. And as you can see at the bottom, there's also a link to the Topos text page and the Recogito annotated image. The Bouleuterion was home to the Boule of the Athenian government. This was the heart of the Athenian government after Cleisthenes split up the Athenian city into 10 different tribes. Each tribe contributed 50 people to the Boule, making up 50 senators in total. Each group of senators served for 1 year. They were chosen at random out of a lottery. And they basically got all the laws together for the city, and they dealt with matters that were not dealt with by the entire city as a whole in the pinks. This is an outline of the Bouleuterion below, as well as its topos text page. Now, there are other names for this. At the time, Pausanias refers to this building as the Council House of the 500. There's also the Bouleuterion. One of the reasons that this building shows how the Agora changed over time was because not only is it different from the Prytaneon in its location and basically its function, but there were two versions of the Bouleuterion. They were laid out very differently. The Athenians thought that the Bouleuterion needed to be expanded upon later to accommodate for either different numbers of senators. The number of tribes has changed throughout history. Sometimes there are 10, sometimes there are up to 13. And basically they just thought it needed to be a bit more spacious of a room, especially as the importance of the boule and the Athenian democracy changed. Finally, we're going to go to the tholos. The tholos was the building that specifically served for the elite members of the boule, and these were called the Prytaneus. The Prytaneus was a select group of 50 members of the boule, which was each tribe at the time. The Prytaneus served the more executive functions, such as, taking letters to the rest of the city and planning the meetings of the boule. And they basically would serve as the Prytaneus for 1/10 of the year. They split up the years differently back in the day. One of the interesting things about the tholos is that because it was a special area for the Prytaneus, many of them actually lived here all the time. There was room for them to sleep. It was known for dining, as we can tell from much of the well-preserved pottery found in the pits that I talked about earlier. And it just shows how the Athenian democracy was valued among its citizens. There were people on call 24 hours of the day within the heart of the democracy to deal with emergencies or any issues that might arise. Pausanias mentions this building as the roundhouse, and just being near the Bouleuterion and the statues of eponymous heroes. There's been multiple different primary sources that say what this was for. However, because of these pots, which you can see the little symbol on each of these pots, and that represented that they were used for the Prytaneon and at the tholos. This is a nice 3D rendering of the building. One of the things that is most interesting is the not only shape, but the roofing tiles used on it. Okay. Another example of growing Athenian power and cultural power was the Stoa Poikile, known as the Painted Stoa. It housed paintings from some of Athens' greatest military achievements. It encompasses the northern border of the Agora, and most people would have seen this right as they enter the complex. And one of the greatest things about this building is it's one of the few that's not owned by a specific cult or administrative duty, and therefore all people are able to go through it at all times. And it became a great meeting area for ordinary citizens to just go into the building and converse, look at the art, and talk philosophy, anything really. This is an image that you can see that depicts the Stoa Poikile at its prime, and there's also an annotated version of this thanks to one of my classmates. The link is below. These paintings were gone into great detail by Pausanias, at least just into what they were. So going from the left to the right, it is the Athenians fighting the Spartans at Oeno, Theseus and the Athenians fighting the Amazons, the Greeks taking Troy in the Battle of Marathon. However, a Roman bishop, traveled to Athens around 400 AD, and they were no longer there. So at some point between 150 AD and 400 AD, these paintings disappeared or were most likely taken by someone. Temple and altar of Ares. It'll be the last thing that I go into great detail on. The temple and altar of Ares have a funny story associated with them that I thought was worth mentioning, and that's the fact that it was completely rebuilt in this location. It was built somewhere else in a different location, and workers and sculptors completely took the building apart block by block and moved it to where it is currently now. That just shows that the Agora was the center of Athenian power, and it showed the Athenian might and showed Athenian influence over the entire city and ancient world, and people wanted to be here. People wanted to put their buildings here. And that's one of the reasons probably that this building was reconstructed, which was a very tedious effort, and relocated here, because the Romans wanted to have their buildings here. They wanted to have a piece of that influence that Athens gave out. Finally is the Panathenaic Way. The Panathenaic Way leads from the Dipylon Gate at the entrance to Athens all the way to the Acropolis, and therefore everyone would have walked through it at some point. Anyone entering the city, anyone going to Athens would have gone through it. Back in the day, it served as a horse racing location and sometimes a foot racing location during the Panathenaic Games. Later, it just became a road to travel through Athens for all to enter through the main gate and get to the Acropolis. However, the Agora is on the way. As you can see, the Acropolis is in the top of the screen. The Dipylon Gate would have been at the bottom of the screen, off screen. And so everyone would travel through the Agora. Now, if you were on the Panathenaic Way and you were looking at the Agora at its peak in about 150 AD, the image to the right is what you would see. This is about a 3D rendering of how the entire Agora would have looked. As you can see, the stoas are immense and massive. There's the Odeon of Agrippa, huge building taking up a lot of space. Again, the Romans wanted to put their mark on an area that showed great influence in the entire ancient world. And they did that with many of these buildings. All right. And through the countless wars and destructions, the Agora was changed over time. Each era was changed due to a war. The Archaic era ended with a Persian invasion. The Classical era ended with a Macedonian invasion. And the Romans, before they added their buildings and took over, actually sacked the Athenian Agora under the Emperor Sulla. But eventually this became too much for the Agora. It was first sacked in 267 AD by the Herulians. Many of these buildings, when you go and read the descriptions I've provided on them, will mention that they were destroyed by the Herulians. Much of the Agora was at this time. However, it was rebuilt. Much of it was rebuilt, maybe not in the same form, but a lot of the buildings were rebuilt after the Herulians sacked much of the Agora. But then the Visigoths invaded in the 4th century, the Vandals in the 5th, and the Slavs in the 6th. And after that, the Agora was abandoned for many hundreds of years. And eventually, buildings were built over it. Romans built buildings over it. The Greeks did. However, once people found out that this was the Agora, the American School of Classical Studies bought the area and began excavations. So if you see here, there's an image about what the Agora looked like on May 25th, 1931, which is the day when the excavation started. And the image below it is taken from almost the exact same angle, exact same viewpoint, and that's what it looks like today. Huge differences in these two. And it's kind of a miracle that so much is preserved and so much is so well preserved, so that we are able to learn about all these buildings in this area, even though it's been a lot of time and a lot has been built over them. Finally, I would just like to make some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Professor Dibble and the members of this class. I use many of their annotations and information with providing information on my buildings. Also thanks to ASCSA.net for providing many of the images used in this project and much of the summaries. For more information on all these buildings, you can go to ASCSA.net, which I've included a link to here. And then Wikimedia Commons provided the images that I used to create the overlays for all these buildings. Those two links are found here as well. Thank you very much, and I hope you do some more research on these buildings on your own. I have provided a great number of links and summaries to most of the buildings within the Agora that have information available to them. Thank you.